The skies over the Pacific in the early days of World War II were a battlefield unlike any the world had ever seen. Sunlight danced off the wings of sleek, silver aircraft, while beneath them, the endless blue of the ocean stretched as far as the eye could see. For the young American pilots who took to the air in those first terrifying months after Pearl Harbor, the enemy they faced was unlike anything they had trained for. They called it the Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a marvel of engineering, a fighter plane that seemed almost supernatural in its capabilities. Lightweight, agile, and fast, it could outmaneuver virtually anything the Americans had in their arsenal, where U.S. fighters struggled to keep pace. The Zero seemed to glide effortlessly, twisting and turning through the sky with an ease that defied gravity itself. It was a terrifying opponent, one that turned every dogfight into a desperate struggle for survival. American pilots were brave, skilled, and determined, yet time and again, they found themselves outclassed. In the early confrontations over the Pacific, the Zero tore through formations, leaving broken planes and shattered lives in its wake. Standard tactics, which had worked in Europe and over other battlefields, were useless against this opponent. The Americans were fighting in the dark, and each loss only deepened the sense of desperation. On the ground, commanders and engineers were equally confounded. They studied wreckage, pored over reports, and ran simulations. Yet the question remained, how do you defeat something that seems invincible? Every encounter with the Zero left pilots and strategists with more questions than answers. The frustration was palpable, the sense of helplessness heavy in the air. Morale wavered, and fear began to creep into the hearts of even the most seasoned flyers. But the story of how the Americans finally turned the tide against the Zero begins not in a lab or a briefing room, but in the mind of a single pilot. His name was not yet famous, but his ingenuity would change the course of the air war in the Pacific. He saw what others had missed, understood the patterns that confounded everyone else, and discovered a method that was as simple as it was brilliant. It started with something almost laughably ordinary, a box of matchsticks. While other pilots relied on complex instruments, detailed reports, and endless trial and error, this man looked for a tangible, visual way to understand the Zero's movements. He needed a method that could translate the chaos of aerial combat into something that could be studied, memorized, and anticipated. The solution he found was elegant, and it relied on a combination of intuition, observation, and hands-on experimentation. Before his discovery, dogfights were brutal, unpredictable, and deadly. Pilots would chase the enemy through cloud banks, dive toward the ocean, and pull up at the last second, hoping against hope that they weren't too late. Many never returned. The Zero was not just a machine, it was a puzzle, one that mocked every attempt to solve it with deadly precision. Its pilot could perform maneuvers that seemed impossible, slipping out of tight turns, accelerating out of dives, and positioning itself perfectly for a killing shot. The Americans were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. But the pilot with the matchsticks saw patterns in the chaos. He began recreating aerial battles on a simple tabletop, using the sticks to represent enemy planes and American fighters. Each stick, each angle, each movement told a story. He could simulate turns, loops, dives, and climbs, recreating the maneuvers that had destroyed his comrades. By visualizing the fight in miniature, he could experiment with tactics without risking a single life. It was a process that required patience, creativity, and a deep understanding of both his aircraft and the enemy's. He was essentially building a three-dimensional puzzle, one where the pieces were planes and the board was the sky itself. The matchsticks were not just tools, they were a language, a way of translating the deadly ballet of aerial combat into something comprehensible. As he refined his methods, he began to see weaknesses where others had only seen strength. The Zero, despite its agility, had limits. It could not sustain high-speed maneuvers forever. It relied on a delicate balance of weight and aerodynamics, which made certain turns and dives dangerous if pushed too far. By studying these limits, the pilot could anticipate enemy movements, position his own plane advantageously, and strike with deadly precision. Word of his method spread slowly at first. Fellow pilots were skeptical. Could something as simple as matchsticks really change the outcome of life and death battles in the sky? Yet, when they saw the results, disbelief turned to awe. Pilots who had been struggling for months suddenly found themselves gaining the upper hand. The Zero, once untouchable, could now be predicted, outmaneuvered, and defeated. This was more than just a tactical breakthrough. It was a psychological revolution. American pilots, who had flown in fear and uncertainty, now had hope. They understood their enemy, could anticipate its moves, and reclaim the skies. The matchsticks had done more than reveal a strategy. They had restored confidence, courage, and a sense of control. The story of how a simple idea, a handful of sticks, and a sharp mind turned the tide against one of the most feared aircraft of World War II is a testament to ingenuity, perseverance, and the human spirit. It reminds us that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful, and that in war, as in life, understanding your opponent is the key to victory. As the Pacific War raged on, this method became a cornerstone of American air tactics. Pilots were trained to think like the Zero, to anticipate its moves, and to exploit its weaknesses. And while the battles remained dangerous, deadly, and intense, the balance had shifted. The invincible enemy had a vulnerability, and American ingenuity had found it. But to truly understand how this breakthrough changed the course of the war, and the daring feats of the pilots who put it into practice, we need to follow the story from the first encounter to the dramatic confrontations in the skies. We need to see the fear, the mistakes, and the brilliance that turned ordinary men into legends of aerial combat. The story of the Zero is not just one of a plane. It is a story of courage, innovation, and the relentless quest to overcome the impossible. And it all started with matchsticks. The pilots' experiments began in quiet corners of the airfields, away from the chaos of warplanes and the roar of engines. While other pilots were hunched over maps, scribbling notes and arguing tactics, he spread matchsticks across tables, arranging them as planes, imagining the sky above, the sun glinting off wings, the endless expanse of blue below. Each stick represented a potential movement, a dive, a climb, a sharp turn. Slowly, painstakingly, he recreated the deadly ballet of dogfights he had witnessed firsthand. He realized quickly that the Zero, despite its remarkable agility, had patterns that could be predicted. It wasn't a machine of pure chaos. Its strengths, the speed, the nimble turns, the tight loops came at a cost. Push the plane too hard, and its weight and balance betrayed it. Its engine could overheat, and its structure could not withstand endless high-speed maneuvers. By arranging matchsticks in precise sequences, he could see how an American fighter could position itself to take advantage of those limits, turning moments of desperation into opportunities. The process was obsessive. He spent hours after missions, analyzing every encounter, placing sticks to replicate attacks and evasions, moving them minutely, observing the angles, the speed, the distances. He would tilt at them slightly, trying one maneuver, then another, testing which sequences allowed an American pilot to gain an advantage. Sometimes the answers were counterintuitive, diving away from the enemy instead of engaging directly, letting the Zero overextend itself before striking, using the sun and clouds to obscure approach angles. Every failure in the air became a lesson for the tabletop, every loss a clue for future survival. Soon, word of his method began to spread among the small circle of pilots who trusted him. They were skeptical at first. How could something as simple as wooden sticks explain a plane that had killed so many of their comrades? But the results spoke for themselves. Pilots who practiced the sequences he devised began to report better survival rates. They could anticipate the Zero's maneuvers, respond quickly, and maintain positions that minimized risk while maximizing offensive potential. For the first time, American airmen felt like they were not merely reacting, they were controlling the fight. He didn't stop at tables and matchsticks. He translated the lessons into practical instructions for the pilots. Simple rules emerged. Keep speed. Don't engage in tight-turning battles. Attack from above or behind when possible. And force the Zero into extended maneuvers that exposed its vulnerabilities. The elegance of the solution lay in its simplicity. There was no need for complicated calculations or advanced instruments. It was about understanding limits, exploiting weaknesses, and thinking one step ahead of an enemy who had seemed unstoppable. the impact was immediate in the skies. Battles that had once been one-sided became contests in which American pilots could fight back. Entire squadrons began to adopt these techniques, and slowly, the Zero lost its aura of invincibility. Pilots began sharing stories of narrow escapes, daring maneuvers, and unexpected victories. The fear that had gripped them was replaced with a cautious optimism. Where once the enemy dictated the terms of combat, now the Americans were beginning to dictate the fight. There were moments of brilliance that could have come straight from a war movie. One pilot, following the new tactics, lured a Zero into a steep climb, forcing it to stall. In the blink of an eye, he dove into position behind it, firing precisely, bringing down the aircraft without risking his own plane. Another pilot used the sun to mask his approach, slipping above the enemy formation, and delivered a perfect burst that shattered a Zero's wings before it could respond. Each success was a proof of concept, a real-world validation of what had seemed like an abstract exercise with wooden sticks on a table, and yet the battle was never easy. The Zero was still a formidable opponent. Pilots had to stay calm under pressure, trust their instincts, and execute maneuvers precisely. Mistakes could be fatal, and every engagement carried the weight of life or death. The difference was that now they had a strategy, a way to tilt the odds in their favor. Instead of flying blind, reacting in panic to the enemy's every move, they had insight. They could read the enemy, anticipate attacks, and make split-second decisions that mattered. Historians later noted that this period marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War. The techniques developed through observation, careful experimentation, and yes, matchsticks allowed American pilots to achieve something previously thought impossible. They could challenge the Zero on its terms and emerge victorious. The war in the air was no longer a series of desperate losses. It became a calculated contest, where skill, preparation, and clever thinking could overcome raw technological superiority. But what made this story remarkable was not just the technical achievement, it was the human ingenuity behind it. In the midst of war, surrounded by death and chaos, a single mind looked at a problem differently. While others saw invincibility, he saw patterns. While others reacted to the enemy, he anticipated it. And in doing so, he gave countless lives a chance to survive, to fight another day, to see the sun rise over the Pacific once more. The story of the Zero is often told in terms of its engineering marvels, its speed, and its fearsome reputation. But the untold story, the story of the matchsticks, the hours of careful study, the mental battles waged far from the roar of engines, is just as critical. It reminds us that innovation often comes not from the most sophisticated tools, but from observation, imagination, and determination. By the time the American forces had fully embraced these tactics, the balance of power in the air had shifted. Pilots became bolder, more confident, and more lethal. They were no longer just surviving, they were winning, and while each battle remained dangerous, filled with risk and uncertainty, they now faced the enemy on more equal terms. The Zero was no longer invincible. It was vulnerable, and American courage, combined with careful study and creativity, had found the way to exploit that vulnerability. As the Pacific campaign continued, the lessons learned through matchsticks and tabletop simulations became standard training. New pilots were taught to think like the Zero, to visualize its moves, and to respond with precision and strategy. What began as a simple experiment in ingenuity had transformed into a doctrine that would save countless lives and contribute significantly to the eventual victory in the air war over the Pacific. The story of this pilot and his matchsticks is a testament to the power of thinking differently. It is a story of turning the tide when all seemed lost, of finding hope in the smallest of tools, and of proving that even in the darkest skies, human creativity can illuminate a path to victory. But the final battles, the ultimate tests of these tactics, were still to come. The moment when theory would meet reality in the skies, when lives hung in the balance, and the true effectiveness of these methods would be proven under fire. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would decide not only the fate of individual pilots, but the very nature of air supremacy in the Pacific. The true test of the matchstick tactics came in the skies above the Pacific, where sun-scorched waves stretched endlessly beneath dogfighting squadrons. The Americans had practiced, planned, and visualized every possible maneuver, but in the air, nothing was guaranteed. The Zero was still fast, still agile, and still lethal. Yet now, armed with knowledge and strategy, the pilots felt something that had been missing in those first desperate months: control. One by one, American fighters took off, engines screaming, hearts pounding, eyes scanning the horizon for the unmistakable shape of the enemy. When the first Zeros appeared, the air seemed to thicken with tension. These were no longer faceless adversaries. They were deadly, intelligent machines, pilots who relied on skill and instinct as much as their aircraft's engineering. But the Americans were ready. Every turn, every climb, every dive had been rehearsed mentally on tables covered with matchsticks, and now those movements were executed with precision in the sky itself. The dogfights began with ferocity. Zeros swooped and spun, attempting to outmaneuver their opponents, but the Americans anticipated almost every move. One pilot, recalling the patterns he had studied, feigned a retreat, drawing the enemy into a long, extended turn. The Zero followed, trusting its superior agility, but in doing so, it overextended. In that split second, the American pilot adjusted, climbing behind and above, firing a precise burst that tore through the enemy aircraft. Another squadron used the sun as cover, approaching from above with stealth, striking before the Zero could even react. The victories were both breathtaking and deadly. For the first time, American pilots were not merely surviving, they were dominating. The tactics developed from those simple matchstick exercises had transformed theory into life-saving reality. Each success reinforced the lessons learned on the ground: understanding the enemy, predicting movements, exploiting weaknesses. The pilots were no longer victims of circumstance, they were masters of the fight. It was not just the wins that mattered, it was the confidence they instilled. Pilots who had been hesitant, fearful, and unsure now flew with boldness. They knew the limits of the Zero, and they trusted themselves to exploit them. This newfound mastery rippled through the air forces, elevating morale and transforming the way American airmen approached combat. No longer were they reactive. Now, they dictated the flow of battle. Stories of extraordinary feats began to circulate. One young pilot lured two Zeros into a steep climb, forcing both aircraft to stall, then executed a precise dive that allowed him to dispatch them both in quick succession. Another squadron, using coordinated maneuvers inspired by the matchstick simulations, ambushed a formation of Zeros, downing 3 before any American plane was hit. Each tale, each encounter, became a legend of ingenuity and courage, demonstrating that even the most fearsome opponent could be defeated through strategy, preparation, and clever thinking. Yet, the victory was never easy. Pilots faced constant danger, the skies filled with smoke, fire, and the terrifying whine of engines. Each dogfight tested nerves, skill, and courage. One miscalculation could mean a crash into the ocean, a sudden burst of enemy fire, or a fatal collision. But the difference now was that mistakes could be minimized, and survival became more than chance. It became a result of careful planning and intelligent execution. The pilot whose matchsticks had inspired this revolution never sought fame or accolades. His satisfaction came from knowing that his method saved lives, gave confidence to frightened flyers, and turned the tide of air combat in the Pacific. He had taken something ordinary, a handful of wooden sticks, and transformed it into a tool of extraordinary consequence. His ingenuity became a symbol of human resourcefulness under pressure, a reminder that even the simplest solutions can achieve profound results. By the end of the year, the impact of these tactics was undeniable. American pilots were no longer overwhelmed by the Zero. They were challenging it on equal terms, and often coming out ahead. The narrative of fear and defeat that had haunted early battles was replaced by one of skill, cunning, and hope. Where once the enemy dictated the fight, the Americans now controlled it. They had learned to think like the Zero, to predict its movements, and to act decisively. The story of how the Zero was finally outmatched is not just a tale of machines and technology. It is a story of observation, creativity, and courage. It is about a pilot who refused to accept the idea of an unbeatable enemy, who experimented, analyzed, and imagined solutions in the quiet moments between battles. It is about the power of understanding your adversary, the value of preparation, and the remarkable ways the human mind can triumph in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As the Pacific War continued, these lessons were passed down, taught to every new pilot who took to the skies. The matchsticks, once a humble tool of experimentation, had become a metaphor for insight, strategy, and perseverance. They represented the idea that even in the darkest, most desperate moments, clever thinking could turn the tide. The Zero remained formidable, but it was no longer invincible. The legacy of this breakthrough endured long after the war ended. It is remembered as a moment when ingenuity overcame fear, when courage was paired with intelligence, and when ordinary tools revealed extraordinary truths. The American pilots who once trembled at the sight of the Zero became the ones who could outmaneuver it, outthink it, and ultimately defeat it. Their victories were built not only on skill and bravery, but on the vision of one pilot who saw a solution in something as simple as a matchstick. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where the sun blazed on endless waves and the roar of engines filled the skies, American pilots discovered that there is no enemy too great for a mind willing to observe, imagine, and innovate. From desperation to triumph, from fear to mastery, the story of the Zero is ultimately a story of human determination and brilliance. And it all began with the simplest of tools, a quiet mind, and a relentless desire to find a way to win.